Before we get going, I just want to acknowledge that we do watch TV, and I just wanted to make mention of the fires that are going around in and around LA. I want to say, if you know of anyone or if you've been directly affected by this, we're with you. We're praying for you. We're trying to find ways to get involved in terms of how we could be a light here in the South Bay, and fortunately or not, we here in the South Bay are a little insulated by everything kind of going on, outside of smoke and ash in the air. But at the same time, too, we see our brothers and sisters from in and around LA that we know family members that are being directly affected by this, and our heart breaks, and with that all being said, we're definitely trying to find ways in which we could be of help outside of obviously prayer. How we could be a light here to our communities here in terms of just supporting our brothers and sisters who've lost everything in this devastating event that's taken place this past week. It just made me really think that context is everything, isn't it? Just crazy how in our world, in our life, could just change on a dime, just like that, right? And last week I shared this passage of scripture that I felt like the Lord led me to, and it came from Philippians 4:8, and it says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, what is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And the idea from the apostle in this instruction is that we have a choice, right? Don't we? We have a choice to choose between what is good and noble, pure and right, versus what is not, and how we approach life. A perspective that allows us to see first what is good, and out of that perspective to see what is not. And man, isn't it hard to see any good out of all the crazy events that transpired this past week. So again, although we, obviously here in the South Bay, we're spared by fire related activities, outside of smoke and ash and bad air quality kind of thing. It's crazy how the news reported like it's an apocalyptic site in these areas that were burned. So again, for those whom have direct contact in losing things, or know of people or family members, friends, church family, brothers and sisters from all over LA who have lost, may God have mercy. May He have mercy on us all in this time. But I don't think the Apostle Paul was insensitive in stating this instruction, and I thought about that, and want to know why? Because, well, he was in prison. Okay, he was in prison while giving this instruction, writing this letter about things and focusing things on whatever is true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Right? He was in prison, actually. Right? He was in prison writing this. And what we know about these ancient prisons and jails is that they didn't really have any regulations. They didn't really care if you lived or you died in this time. Right? Meaning, if you didn't have friends or family or anyone to feed you literally while you were in prison, you would basically starve to death. Right? Getting back to the idea of the koinonia, right, we talked about last week, right, to see the beauty beyond the ashes, right? And koinonia is basically the intertwined, interlinked, literally family that Paul was referring to, or people that were interconnected literally in terms of living life together, right? This is what Paul's talking about, and he was most definitely practicing what he preached in a lot of ways. Now again, last week we learned at the beginning of this letter, Paul addressed the entire assembly, right, in Philippi, the saints, bishops, deacons, everybody. And fun fact I just realized too is that people that identified as bishops, pastors, deacons, back in this time, did you know that they were actually borrowed terms from the cultural context of temples and relationships with the gods, like the little g gods in this time, at this time. So basically anyone devoted to the temple or any object devoted to the gods. Household temples, merchants' Slaveholders all were appointed quote unquote shepherds, or how we know it as pastors, or of that time, or overseers to manage their work. So basically anyone who worked in or had a specific role in the temple or in the community's relationship with the gods was a minister. So how the Apostle Paul is addressing the people in Philippi was language that they all basically knew back in this time, because it was all identified basically as the same in terms of saints, bishops, deacons, that of the matter. So right from the start of the letter, we know that Paul and the community in Philippi, they have, well, it's a little bit of a different and a unique kind of relationship, at least unique among the other communities in which he writes. So we will continue to see Paul's instruction to the assembly in Philippi right now, and continue the thought about, again, what is good, noble, pure, and right. So our scripture today comes from Philippians 1, 12 through 30. Philippians 1, 12 through 30. And it is a fairly bigger portion of scripture. So we won't read the entire thing, but I encourage you all to do that, because it is a really interesting piece of scripture that I encourage you all to read on your own time. But we will take bits and pieces and attempt to kind of connect some dots. So we're going to start at Philippians 1, 12, and we'll end at 14 for this part. And it says this: "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of my brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear." Now, if you remember, a few verses ago, or last week, we talked about, the apostle mentioned that the koinonia, remember that? The koinonia, the community whose lives were literally linked together, that gave him confidence. Okay? So remember, these are the people that literally kept Paul going and alive while in prison. So again, going back to the idea that the apostle Paul may be a huge figure and a huge, character, but he had a whole community around him helping him as well. And we see our scriptures open as Paul is extolling his community, being more confident to proclaim the gospel because of his example being in literal chains. Okay? So in verse 13, he mentions that the whole palace guard and everyone knows that he's in chains for Christ. Now, other translations state that the whole imperial guard. Getting a little bit more specific, Paul notes that most of those whom he has encountered while detained with the elite Roman guard, or going back to using first century language, the Praetorian. The Praetorian was the elite Roman guard, and these were the personal bodyguards for the emperor. Okay, so when Paul says in 13 that the whole palace guard and everyone knows that I'm in chains for the gospel, he's referring to the Praetorian. He's referring to the elite Roman guard, who basically are the bodyguards for the emperor at this time. Okay? And it sounds like the guards with this knowledge are invoking that knowledge in their conversation with Paul. So this rhetoric paints a picture of some guards who taunt Paul in the name or with the name of Christ, and others who do so in their compassion for him. So therefore, Paul was in deep conversations about faith, life, with the dudes whom had access to the most powerful man in the world at this time, all while being in prison, right? Talk about making the best out of a very, very poor situation, okay? So we'll skip down a few verses to verse 20. It says this: "I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. I want to quote the late Martin Lloyd-Jones. Martin Lloyd-Jones was a former Welsh Congregationalist minister and medical doctor because, well, I guess he got bored of being a pastor. They decided to be a doctor too. He says this: death was nothing to these apostles. Death was nothing to these apostles. They had already passed from death to life. Having passed from judgment to life in him, they were not afraid of death. They knew where they were going. They were going to be with Christ, which is far better. So, in the scripture, Paul, he's being extremely transparent here. Extremely transparent. He admits that he would personally prefer death over his current hardship or situation currently in prison. Okay? He's able to claim joy wherever he is. Okay? If you kind of get that inference from even just reading the scripture. Christ will be exalted in his body whether he lives or he dies. He is fully confident of that. And so, while he admits that he would prefer to die and be with Christ, he realizes that continuing and laboring for this assembly here in Philippi, even in prison, is better for them. The theme of service of Christ as foremost and location as secondary comes through loud and clear. That he is determined that Christ will be exalted in his body, whether by life or by death. Amazing. Paul can smile and say thank you to God in prison because he has learned to set and reset his focus on the presence of Christ and his mission as Christ's servant. Now again, I encourage you all to look over the entirety of Philippians 1 as it is rich in terms of Paul's address to these people, to this specific group of people in Philippi, and really look at what Paul was trying to impart to this community and why it's important even for us, thousands of years later, to take to heart. Now, looking at our last scripture for today, it comes from Philippians 1, 27 and 28. Skipping down a few more verses, and it says this: whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in the one Spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. Whatever happens, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, no matter what. Okay? I want us to kind of think about that and really take that home with us. Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, no matter what. Okay? No matter what. Again, Paul's in prison. Okay? He's in prison while writing this. And he's saying, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Now, in theory, the idea here is that if we have Christ as our foundation, like a foundation of a house kind of thing, it's unshakable, right? Then no matter what circumstances come our way, yes, it will be hard. Yes, it will suck. It will be heartbreaking, okay? We can have assurance that God is still present and in our midst and on our side. And this is the idea of Christmas, right? We just celebrated, a few weeks back, the idea of Emmanuel, right? The prophet Isaiah prophesied that Emmanuel, right? God with us. God with us. Because how one sees life usually defines how one would face life. Okay? Because how one sees life usually defines how one would face it. It's not just suffering that has eternal value, okay? But it's how you encounter the suffering, okay? Standing firm in unity and in community with other believers that bears witness to the gospel, okay? How you do it, right? The call is you do it together, okay? You do it together. You lean on one another, and that bears witness, and that act in itself bears witness to the gospel. Knowing this value of suffering instills confidence and confirms salvation. When we endure, grace abounds, not only within us, but in our community, the koinonia, right? These verses, the scripture that we just looked at, highlight both the difficulty of Paul's circumstances and his joy in the midst of them. Talk about two differing poles, right? One is Paul's in prison, right? In a very dire, vulnerable situation, but he's exuding the joy in the midst of them, right? The perspective he displays towards the suffering, the spiteful efforts of his enemies, and his questionable prospects towards the future points to some very, very core understandings about his life that flow from the gospel. We can't have confidence in the face of difficult days without the same foundation from which to see all of life, right? Back to that foundation, right? The gospel does not merely give us hope for some point in the future. Neither does it rescue us from the sufferings of today. But Jesus' death and resurrection do show us that suffering can have meaning. Okay? It can have meaning. And that it can bring about God's redemptive purpose for the world around us, right? Maybe we won't know it, right? But our suffering, the things that we go through, can have meaning. And somehow, some way, it can bring about God's redemptive purpose for the world around us. This perspective is one of the great contributions of the gospel for our lives this side of heaven. Okay? As we close, just a few more thoughts on the idea of koinonia. Koinonia, again, is a partnership, right? The partnership, the intertwining of lives living together that Paul says gives him confidence. I just want to refer back to, one or two stories that I've, come across this past week in watching the news and all the things that have been kind of going on with the fires in and around LA. One particular one stuck out to me in terms of the Pasadena one, or the Eaton fire, and there was a news crew up in this really, really small section of a neighborhood, and there were just maybe 2 or 3 people just kind of running around. And this one particular woman that they caught and interviewed, she just talked about how the smoke was just so thick and just you couldn't really see in front of you couldn't see your hand in front of you, and it was just a really dire situation. And she was just trying to explain that she was just trying to help out other neighbors because the fire department hasn't gotten all the way up in their little neighborhood. And then right at the end of the conversation of her wanting to help, and just her kind of running around and trying to be a good neighbor to just the people that live next to her, she mentioned right at the end how her house burned down, right? She lost everything, and she kind of stopped and I think contemplated on that idea for a little bit, and she kind of broke a little bit. In the midst of that happening, she had the wherewithal and the mindset to go and help, right? And do what she could for her neighbors, putting out, small embers and small hotspots that were around her neighbors' homes when her house already burned to the ground. And I think about that and I think, wow, I don't know where that comes from, but I'd imagine that comes from a place of merely just giving of herself and giving of her life and giving of everything that she can to help save others around her, despite her own circumstance. Again, I invite us and I encourage us to think about this idea of koinonia, what it really, really practically means to us in our lives, because I feel like we're hearing, and I bet a lot of us have heard stories like this kind of come in and around the news, and I feel like whenever things like this happen, we see a community kind of rise above the ashes in a lot of ways in terms of helping one another out. Unfortunately, it takes something like this to really happen sometimes, but I feel like it's a really, really good definition of what the gospel is all about, what everything that the Apostle Paul is trying to teach us here in terms of living our lives in sacrifice for not only ourselves, but for our neighbors, right? And what does that actually look and feel like? So I pray that we would hang in there. I pray that we would be able to have a clear perspective in terms of this idea of koinonia, this idea that the Apostle Paul is trying to impart to this community. And I pray that we would all stay safe too from the smoke, ashes, wherever you may be, at this point, physically, I guess. And again, if you have, you know of anybody or have direct contact with anyone in terms of being affected by these fires, I pray that, we just, let them know that we're praying for them. We are hoping for the best in the situation. And again, if you stay tuned, we'll hopefully come up with a few things we can in terms of giving back to our communities as well. So in the meantime, I pray that we would be able to experience God's presence and peace in this kind of unstable and uncertain time that we're in, that we will be able just to, again, have that foundation and that unshakable faith in terms, and to know that God is here and God is present and God is alive in this time.